Prince wasn't just a musical genius, a man the public hailed as the Prince of Funk. He also created a famous band, only to forbid them from playing his own music. You heard that right, The Time. The funk group that once sent America into a frenzy was in fact a stage built entirely by Prince, and behind it was a terrifying secret. The most chilling part is that for years, no one in the band dared to say a word until the contracts leaked and Prince was no longer alive to control it all. In today's video, for the first time ever, you'll hear a truly shocking truth about who Prince really was behind the flawless mask of a genius. To understand why a genius like Prince would build an entire band only to quietly turn them into puppets, we have to go back to where it all began. That was in Minneapolis. The summer of 1981, when The Time was born in silence, already carrying the seeds of a rebellion that would be crushed. In 1981, Prince was on the brink of a breakthrough. He had just released the album Dirty Mind at the end of the previous year, which made waves not only for its bold sound blending funk, new wave, and rock, but also for its provocative, sensual image that stood apart from any other black artist of the time. Minneapolis, his hometown, wasn't seen as a musical hub then, but it was precisely there that Prince was quietly preparing his next move, a plan no one could have predicted. He wasn't satisfied with just one band to express his vision. The Revolution, his main band, still couldn't help him reach what he truly craved, a raw, authentic funk rhythm, deeply rooted in black culture, vibrant but tight true to the spirit of the Minneapolis sound he was shaping. That's why Prince began to build a new group, not to share the spotlight, but to project a different version of himself through someone else. That spring, he started picking members from a local band called Flight Time. These musicians had no idea they were stepping into something extraordinary. When Prince chose Morris Day as the lead singer for The Time, many in the industry thought it was the perfect pairing of two childhood friends who grew up together in Minneapolis. Morris not only had striking looks, but also a cocky, humorous stage persona that matched the sound Prince was chasing. On the surface, he was destined to be a frontman, a perfect face for a new, bold, and funky group. But even Morris couldn't have imagined that Prince never intended to give control to anyone, not even an old friend. In the studio, Prince didn't let Morris write lyrics, didn't allow him to co-arrange, and even recorded Morris's vocals only to quietly tweak every single line without telling him. On stage, every move, every introduction, every interaction with the audience was pre-planned by Prince. Even the way Morris smiled, the way he walked to center stage, had to be perfectly in sync with what had already been scripted. Prince never saw Morris as a collaborator. He saw him as a character, a lead actor in a play Prince had both written and directed. And in that script, Morris was given the spotlight but never shown who held the switch. By July 1981, the group's first album, titled The Time, was officially released. But what no audience, not even a single member of the band, could have imagined was that the entire music on that record wasn't played by The Time at all. Not one person in the band was involved in the recording process. Every drum beat, every bass line, every guitar riff or keyboard section was performed by Prince himself, inside the recording room at Sunset Sound in Los Angeles. He worked alone for many days, sometimes recording for up to 16 hours straight without rest, just to make sure every sound layer matched the exact picture he had in his mind. This was no longer ordinary music production. This was the work of someone who was not only a musician, but also a director, a designer, and the scriptwriter of a performance in which the actors were never allowed to know the real plot. Prince did not sign his real name on the production credits. Instead, he used a strange alias, Jimmy Star. He kept his role invisible. On the album cover, his name appeared nowhere. In promotional interviews, no one was allowed to mention him too much. And in rehearsals, everything was tweaked to ensure that the members of The Time only did one thing: perform what had already been pre-arranged. From that very moment, a band that seemed to be formed to shine was, in reality, created to serve the overwhelming shadow named Prince. And even to this day, people still can't decide whether it was a display of genius creativity or a terrifying form of absolute control. And it was from that same operating model, where everything was silently decided by Prince, that a major rupture began. one that would mark the beginning of an irreparable split. That crack started with two names that would go on to change the entire music industry: Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. In March 1983, while the Ice Cream Castle album was in its final recording stages at Sunset Sound in Los Angeles, things within the group seemed to be calm at that time. The Time held a solid position as part of the Triple Threat Tour alongside Prince and Vanity 6. However, between the applause and the packed schedule, there were sounds of something breaking that no one seemed to hear. Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, who played keyboards and bass respectively, were not only great musicians but also promising producers. On days off from touring, they often flew to Atlanta to work on productions for other artists, including the rising R&B group SOS Band. With their sharp musical vision, they quickly proved themselves to be far more than just performers in a tightly controlled band. And then, an unexpected accident happened. On March 10, 1983, while working at a studio in Atlanta, Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis were stranded due to a major snowstorm that swept through the southeastern U.S. Flights were canceled en masse. They couldn't make it back in time for the Time's scheduled show in San Antonio. The other members of the band thought Prince would understand. They assumed it was an unavoidable situation. But they forgot that to Prince. Nothing was out of his control, and no mistake was forgivable if it meant he would lose face on stage. When Jimmy and Terry finally arrived in Los Angeles 2 days later, they entered the Sunset Sound studio as usual, expecting to get back to work. But no one greeted them. No one asked what had happened. Prince was already there, sitting silently behind the mixing board, not lifting his head as they walked in. On the table was a folded piece of paper, placed next to a steaming cup of coffee. One of the nearby technicians signaled with his eyes, as if to warn them. Jimmy opened the note, which contained only a single handwritten line. "They're out. I don't accept any apology." Without giving them a chance to explain, Prince said nothing more. He stood up, walked out of the studio, leaving behind a silence so thick it was suffocating. The rest of the crew didn't know how to react. Morris Day, who had been recording a vocal line for "If the Kid Can't Make You Come," stepped out into the hallway, hesitant, sensing the tension in the air. That night, at a small bar on Sunset Boulevard, Morris met up with Jimmy and Terry. They sat in a dark corner, saying nothing for several minutes. Jimmy was the one to break the silence. "Did you know he'd do this?" Morris didn't answer right away. He looked down, tapping his finger lightly on his untouched glass of liquor. "When you two missed the show, he called me up to his office," Morris said, voice low. Terry asked, "Did he ask whether you thought we should stay? And what did you say?" Morris could only reply, "I said, keep them." But he just looked at me and said, "If I didn't shut this down, he'd dissolve the whole band. He told me this isn't a band, this is a design, and anyone who messes up the design has to go." Jimmy said nothing more. He picked up his coat, stood up because he understood everything, and they left. That was also the last time the Time existed with its original lineup intact. After the firing, Prince continued to finalize Ice Cream Castle without Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, even though they had already contributed ideas and early demo tracks for the main songs. He replaced their parts with his own new arrangements and left their names out of the credits. Morris Day stayed silent from then on. He didn't leave the band, but his passion seemed to fade. In an interview many years later, he said, "I was caught in a storm and couldn't do anything. I was best friends with all three of them. But at the time, I was only allowed to choose one." As for Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, that shock didn't destroy them. In fact, it led them down their own path a year later. They produced Just Be Good to Me for the SOS Band, a hit that launched a string of unimaginable success. By 1986, they had redefined modern R&B when they produced Control for Janet Jackson, a milestone that changed the entire American music market. A snowstorm that seemed harmless ended up becoming a historic turning point. And from that day at Sunset Sound, the Time lost two geniuses. Prince, though still holding absolute power, also lost two collaborators who might have written a whole new chapter for the empire in his name. Not long after that painful firing, while the group's internal atmosphere hadn't yet recovered, they entered one of the most intense tours of their career. It was a string of shows called the Triple Threat Tour, taking place from November 1982 to April 1983, where the spotlight didn't just shine on fiery performances, it exposed every crack in the relationship between Prince and the band he had created. This was no longer just a concert tour. It was a silent war between Prince and the members of the time. And during this period, Prince's true nature became most apparent. The Time was usually assigned to open the nights, but that didn't mean they were respected as part of the show. From the very first gigs, Prince ordered the sound crew to adjust the Time stage monitors just enough for them to hear the basic beat, but don't let them hear the full mix. He didn't want to take risks. He didn't want the Time to outshine him. And he especially didn't want Morris Day, who was becoming too charismatic, to steal the audience's heart before Prince made his entrance. Morris realized it very early on, backstage before every show, while checking his in-ear monitors and mic. He always sensed something was off. Some nights, the drums were unbearably loud. Other nights, the guitar nearly vanished on stage. But when he asked the sound crew, the answer was always, "It's set up correctly." Everything went by as if the fault lay with them until one of the lighting team, who'd known Morris since Flight Time, revealed during cleanup after the Detroit show that Prince had specifically ordered the audio to be just bad enough so the band members weren't too good. Morris stayed silent, even after learning that. But the atmosphere between shows tightened like a guitar string. It peaked on the San Antonio gig when something almost staged took place. That night, Prince asked Morris to try on a new outfit before the show. It was a deep purple sequin-studded suit, nearly identical to the one Prince himself would later wear. The assistant brought it. Morris hesitated for a moment but put it on, assuming it was a coincidence or some stylistic stunt for visual cohesion. That is, until he noticed the right sleeve was cut nearly 4 inches shorter than the left. It wasn't a technical mistake. It was purposeful, because on that arm, Morris had an old scar left over from a minor bike crash years earlier. It wasn't large, but it was darkened and uneven. Under the stage lights, it showed, and Morris understood perfectly well why. Quietly, he changed back into his old suit, folded the purple one into its garment bag, said nothing. But later that night, just before going on stage, Prince passed him in the narrow hallway, looked straight at him, and softly said, "Just loud enough for the two of them. Why not wear the new one? It was made for you." Morris said nothing. Prince gave a slight smile and walked away. From that moment, everything on stage became a silent battlefield. Morris performed with tense restraint, as if holding himself back from exploding, but the audience had no idea. They cheered wildly, even some nights. Their cheering for the Time sounded louder than when Prince came out. That only made the backstage tension even thicker. In private meetings between the band and production team, Prince began talking about adjusting the Time's set length, cutting Jellybean's drum solo short, asking Jesse Johnson to skip the extended guitar intro in Cool. He said it was about saving time for the headliner, but everyone understood it was a quiet warning. Go too far, and you'd be reined in. One event in Chicago stands out in Morris's memory. Prince stood off stage, watching their performance on a monitor. After the Time finished, the crowd chanted Morris's name non-stop. As he walked by, Prince said nothing. He just grabbed a marker and scrawled on the wall-mounted notepad, "Crowds love mediocre people fast. Then they forget them just as fast." Short sentence, but enough to make Morris understand he would never be allowed to shine for long. That hostility wasn't always overt, but it seeped into every small detail. How the lighting was biased, how the LED graphics dimmed the Time's image, then boosted contrast when Prince appeared, how backstage catering was scheduled unevenly, and above all, how Prince maintained silence, organized, strategic, controlling. That conflict would later be depicted in the 1984 film Purple Rain, where Prince cast Morris Day as a shallow, flamboyant foil always overshadowed. Morris couldn't refuse. The script was already written. He just had to play himself. Once again, Morris became a character in Prince's story, always meant to be in the background. Those tours, which should have been opportunities to showcase talent and camaraderie, instead became psychological battlefields where winning didn't necessarily bring happiness. The ones who left, carrying silent wounds, were the ones who continued the musical legacy in their own way. By the end of 1984, as the Purple Rain Tour wound down, the simmering tension in the Time could no longer stay hidden. On stage, everything looked the same. Morris Day still emerged in sparkling outfits, flashing confident, playful performances. Inside, however, he felt an increasing fatigue. He began to sense he had no real control over his own performance lighting, sound, stage presence, all filtered through Prince's design. During those months, Morris gradually realized he was no longer a free artist, but rather a constructed character. So one evening after the Philadelphia show, after stepping off stage to enthusiastic applause, Morris sat silently in front of a mirror, studying himself. In that moment, only one thought remained. Who am I performing for finally? He picked up his phone and calmly said to his manager, "I want to stop. I can't go on being a copy any longer." Soon after, his departure from the group was announced. Fans were shocked, but those on the inside knew it was inevitable. Prince's tightening control and the pressure that Morris must never outshine the founder had pushed him to his limit. Leaving wasn't what he wanted, it was necessary to keep himself. After departing, Morris began carving his own path. He stayed true to his funk roots, aiming to bring back that vibrant energy the Time had brought. But a major hurdle appeared from the outset. On his solo tour posters, he used the phrase, "Morris Day, the Time Experience." He wanted audiences to know the Time spirit lived on, but days later, a black envelope arrived at his office. Inside was a short handwritten note. No greeting, no explanation, just 3 stark words in black ink. Of course not. It was Prince's handwriting, and once again, Prince set a boundary. Even though Morris left, he wouldn't allow that past to live on under a name he owned. The name The Time was no longer a memory, it was Prince's property. While Morris struggled to define himself, 2 others discarded by Prince in bitter fashion built a new empire. Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, fired after a snowstorm kept them from a show, didn't complain or beg for press sympathy. Instead, they moved to Los Angeles, set up a makeshift studio in an old garage, and started fresh. No big budget, no fancy gear, but they had something no one could take away: talent and the drive to prove their worth. With labels still skeptical, they quietly took on young artists. They worked day and night for little pay but never gave up. Then in 1986, Janet Jackson, still living in her family's shadow, came to them, wanting a new, bold sound. Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis delivered the demo for Nasty. Although labels hesitated, Janet trusted them fully. The album Control dropped like a generational statement, a shock to the music world. She became a global star, and Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis were hailed as top American producers. They showed you don't need your old name to make your music heard. In a 1987 Rolling Stone interview, asked about Prince, Terry Lewis simply smiled at the camera and said, "Prince opened the door for us, then kicked us out the back. No worries, that's how we learned to fly." It wasn't bitterness, it was a gentle truth, heavy with meaning. That push let them soar. From then on, Jimmy and Terry produced hit after hit for Mariah Carey, Boyz II Men, Usher, Mary J. Blige, and many others. They won Grammys, were honored in the Songwriters Hall of Fame, and helped redefine modern R&B. Ironically, the very people Prince once saw as trouble became architects of mainstream music. Morris Day, though never reaching their heights, maintained his own standing. He continued performing and writing. He couldn't officially use the Time, but in his fans' hearts, he remained the soul of the band. For him, leaving wasn't an end, it was the only way to finally stand on stage as a free artist. In July 1990, the Time reformed with the album Pandemonium. After years of silence, the band, nearly its original lineup, reconvened at Paisley Park, Prince's studio and venue complex in Chanhassen, Minnesota. Though Prince took part behind the scenes, he again denied them full promotional rights, no official tour, no talk show appearances, no media push. The album came out, charted on Billboard, but was treated like a side project. The band reunited, but still under Prince's boundaries. Throughout the 90s, Morris Day continued performing solo under Morris Day and the Time, in venues like Las Vegas, Detroit, and Oakland. He drew thousands with high-energy shows, though no longer an official band. The Time's name still appeared on tickets, posters, and promotions, in the fans' minds. The Time never disappeared. But everything changed in October 2011, during a reunion effort for a new album, Condensate. The original members were barred from using the Time name. No licensing agreement from Prince existed, forced to pick another. They reluctantly chose the original 7ven to indicate it was still them. On October 18, 2011, Condensate was released, but without the intended impact. Though still funky, the public didn't recognize them under the unfamiliar name. They performed in Los Angeles and New York, but sales were low after shows. Morris often sighed to the group, "If we could have used the old name, things would be different." Then, on April 21, 2016, Prince died suddenly at Paisley Park at age 57. News swept the world. Fans mourned and media dubbed him an immortal legend. For the people who worked closest with him, like Morris Day, the emotions were more complicated: loss and cautious hope. Soon after the funeral, Morris contacted the Prince Estate's management to request permission to use the Time name in upcoming performances. He believed that after Prince's death, personal restrictions would be lifted. But the reply stunned him. On March 15, 2022, the estate's legal office sent an official email demanding Morris immediately cease using the Time in any form of performance, commerce, or promotion. Shortly after, Morris posted on social media, quoting the response, "I spent my life building that name, and now they want to erase me from it." The post was shared tens of thousands of times. The Times fan page erupted with outrage. Many wrote without Morris, there'd be no "The Time you're fighting to keep" name of in later shows. Morris avoided placing the Time on banners. Backstage at a San Diego show, he sat quietly in his dressing room, holding the old shirt with the Time logo he'd worn in 1983. It had become a keepsake, no longer a legal brand. Meanwhile, on June 5, 2022, the Time received its star at First Avenue in Minneapolis, the iconic club from Purple Rain where they and Prince shared the stage in the 80s. Thousands attended, but not a single representative from Prince's estate appeared. No congratulations, no speech, no flowers. Morris took the podium, scanned the room filled with old fans, some gray-haired, some with grandchildren, and said steadily, though his eyes glistened, "For 40 years. We lived under this name, we performed, we wrote songs, we took it around the world. If you remember the Time today, it's not because of a contract, but because of our love of music. And even if we can't use that name on stage anymore, we are still us. No one can take that away." The audience rose in applause. Some wept, understanding that some things should never become disputes. A name is a legal matter. Memories can't be taken. Since then, Morris Day has continued performing under a different name. Every contract is carefully checked to avoid breaching Prince Estate terms. Negotiations to regain the Time name are ongoing, with no resolution. Other band members feel the same frustration. They don't understand why they're barred from a name tied to their lives, especially since Prince never forbade it when he was alive. The irony is, after his passing, his legacy is now governed by legal offices instead of the spirit of music. Perhaps the Time will never reclaim their official name, but their music lives on. Cool 777 9311 Jungle Love still play at parties, festivals, and on the radio. And for fans, they don't need a license to know who the Time really are. Looking back on the Time's journey, the most haunting truth isn't that they were controlled, cast aside, or denied their own name. It's that they were created to serve Prince's musical vision, and yet none of them were mentioned in his will. Remember how it started in 1981 in a Minneapolis studio, where Prince recorded the Time's debut album entirely by himself? Without the band even knowing, that secret only came out months into their live performances. Then, the unexpected firings in a snowstorm. When Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis missed one show and Prince made a brutal decision. Then the tours where the Time's monitors were turned off. They performed behind curtains, forced to wear outfits styled like Prince's but intentionally designed to look worse. And Morris Day became a flashy character in Purple Rain, set up only to let Prince shine. We also can't forget 2011 when they reunited but were not allowed to use the Time name, forced to use the original 7ven. And the climax came in 2022 when Prince's estate legally barred Morris Day from using a name he'd carried for nearly 40 years. Looking back, a clear truth emerges. The time were born from a genius's hand, but were crushed by that same hand. Prince created them but never truly treated them as equals. To him, they were tools, supporting imagery, stage accessories he shaped to his design. So after everything, do you think behind the genius lauded by the world, Prince was also an authoritarian? Selfish man who wouldn't allow anyone to step outside the lines he drew? Or do you believe it was the price to pay to make his music immortal? Tell me what you think in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to keep following stories never told before.